do you remember where we were at?
Yes, in actual fact, yeah. I think the last time we were together, we were actually examining, and for a very good reason, we were actually looking at, the entire history, of the ANC. But in doing so, we were focused on other themes, particularly themes that are very significant just in terms of the history of the liberation struggle, throughout the 20th century. And the point at which we were was at the end of the 1950s. But this gives us an opportunity to reflect on the reason why we would have had to cover the early period. The most important reason here is to try and determine, whether, the ANC can be said to be a black radical political formation, which is often being claimed, or alternatively, that from the very beginning, it sought to work within a system. And in that case, it would have been, within the colonial system. And part of what we see, is the ANC bestowing some kind of recognition, on British sovereignty, for instance, over South Africa. And this is the ways in which they actually communicate, with British authorities, particularly in the early period. But what we are pursuing here is an understanding of what actually happens to the black radical tradition. We have a clear sense, of what the black radical tradition would have looked like, in the 19th century. And we actually trace it right down to the early moment of the 20th century. And the last, kind of major event that we referred to was the Bambata Rebellion. And part of what we wanted to work out was what is it that the Bambata Rebellion bestows on the 20th century as a kind of defining political and paradigmatic tradition that is going to inform, black resistance in the 20th century. Now, we said that in 1906, two traditions actually emerge. One is to actually work within the system, and the ANC or the SACP, when it is established, seem to be veering in that direction. But part of what we have to explain is, for instance, we took the first 10 years, of the formation of the ANC and tested that, against the kinds of demands that black people or the natives, would have been making at this stage. So we looked at the period 1912 to 1921, just to see how the ANC would have responded, or the SACP, which is what it was at the time, responded to what would have been major political developments. Formed in 1912, the very first challenge that it is confronted with, and we explained this last week, was the Native Land Act of 1913. Let's quickly, reiterate and say the ANC did not respond to this, because part of what was happening here, contrary to conventional wisdom, the Land Act was about attacking a particular segment of black society, and we said these were independent producers. Other terms used to explain them is they were sharecroppers, particularly in commercial agricultural regions, such as the Orange Free State and the Southern Transvaal. But we know, that the Land Act was actually an attack, on the independence of African producers, and it was not an instrument of land dispossession. Be that as it may, the ANC did not respond to this, just in terms of the ways in which it impacted on a particular segment of black society. And we also did mention the fact that Sol Plaatje himself actually came out of a sharecropper family, and he would have been very familiar with what, the threat that 1913 Land Act would have posed. but collectively, the ANC was unable, or even organizationally, it was not structured in such a way that it could have responded to this. But then the war happens in 1914, and the ANC can be excused, for the next 5 years for not doing much, because that's when the First World War is actually raging. But we actually did explain that in 1918, when the war ended, there were a number of, events that the ANC could have, gotten involved in. There was first the sanitary bucket strike in Johannesburg. We explained all that. And there was also the miners' strike in 1920. The issue here, and this is where we need to stop and begin to consider, the state of the black radical tradition at this stage, because it is at this stage that the black radical tradition begins to take shape. Maybe not begin to take shape because it had been there, in the 19th century, but at this stage, it is coming onto the fore, and it is beginning to actually make an impression on the political landscape. And we did explain what event would have been the first, that, catapulted a formation, a movement that was actually, black radical in terms of its character. And this is where we, made use of Ama Israeli and Enoch Mgijima, as entering that stage. There is an explanation that we need to give, so that people can understand the Ama Israeli not as a religious sect, but as a community, a community that is made up of individuals who are part of families that are part of clans. And this actually constitutes a community. And it is as a community that they engage with the colonial state. And what they require in fact, they do not even require. What they are defending here is their ability to continue with life as they had been, before 1919. Because that's when the controversy between them and the colonial state actually emerges. And, throughout, it becomes quite clear that just in terms of its characterization, Ama Israeli and Enoch Mgijima are clearly a black radical expression. Now, what gives credence to this claim is the fact that at this stage, Enoch Mgijima and Ama Israeli are quite aware and very conscious of what is happening in the US, particularly in black communities in the US. At the same time, you are having a mass movement organized by Marcus Garvey, and this is the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Now, the UNIA has chapters, across the East African coastline, from Malawi into Tanzania and then into South Africa. In actual fact, some of the formations that emerge in the 1920s see themselves as chapters of UNIA in South Africa. No doubt, Marcus Garvey represents at the global level, for that matter, not only in the US, but at the global level, Marcus Garvey represents the black radical tradition. And there is no doubt, that it is the Garveyite movement that begins. It does not inspire Ama Israeli, but what it does, is to give their kind of struggle a measure of intelligibility, something that they can be able to communicate and explain. But in essence, they are not inspired by the Garveyite tradition, but they do actually appropriate Garveyite symbols, into their struggles. And no doubt that gives them the black radical character, that we see being downplayed, in South African historiography. The Demolora wants to raise a question, and I think, this is the way we are going to go about it. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Robert Vinson explicitly draws the connection between Ama Israeli's movement and their readiness and willingness to confront the colonial state. links it to the World Congress that the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or Marcus Garvey, had held in 1920. And apparently his nephew had written a letter to Enoch Mgijima reporting on these proceedings,
Yes,
and particularly highlighting the Black Star liner,
Yes,
this shipping network, you know what I'm saying, and the fact that Garvey's parades had a militaristic kind of tone to them. So there was very much a sense that this was a movement ready to take on power.
Yes,
And these were the impressions that were black people worldwide were receiving. Yes, I suppose Enoch Mgijima and his Israeli movement would have been part of that, of those ripples.
And also, and it is Gilbert that you are referring to, Gilbert Mgijima.
Yes, okay.
Enoch Mgijima's nephew. Gilbert was actually Charles's son. Charles was Enoch Mgijima's brother. In fact, at the end of the Ama-Israeli thing, it is Charles and Enoch who are actually being taken, through the court system, and they are convicted. But yes, actually, Gilbert was working in Durban, and in fact, there are a couple of other things that actually come into play. Gilbert was actually working in Durban. And at some point, remember, the whole controversy between the colonial state and Enoch Mgijima begins in 1919. And it goes on, for 2 years up to 1921. And in that 2-year period, there is, communications back and forth, between the local magistrate and Enoch Mgijima. And in one of these, Mgijima makes the promise that we are going to be moving away from your land, but wait until it is Passover. And that was the 1920 Passover. The Passover came and went. But instead of moving away from this area, which the colonial state claimed was vacant crown land, they decided to extend their settlement, beyond where they were. And this was quite, a sign of aggression on the part of the colonial state. It is at this point that the ANC tries to intervene. And, Mgijima simply ignores them. Makhato writes that letter. But the interesting thing with the Garvey thing is that, in one of the meetings, there is someone who is, in fact, a representative of UNIA, who addresses the meeting in Durban and talks about Garvey coming to South Africa. Hence, Vincent's book is titled The Americans Are Coming. It is called The Americans Are Coming because, there is a belief that Garvey and his African Americans are coming to free, black society from the white race. In actual fact, what the representative said was that, Garvey will be coming in aeroplanes, and they'll be dropping charcoal bombs on white society. And people, this makes it millenarian, no doubt. But the issue is that should not mask, the kind of conflict that is going on the ground. The conflict going on the ground is that Ama-Israeli are a community. And what is happening is that as the community grows, the demand for land also grows. The need, to move into other spaces and establish homesteads and build schools and build churches, because these are independent. They are an independent, church denomination. So these are the things that they need to do, and also to provide, for livestock, to provide land for livestock. These are basic, material demands that these people actually have, or that they are actually defending, and it is important to understand that. Now, the whole controversy come to a face in 1921, when it becomes clear that Ama-Israeli are not going to comply with the order to move away. And it was in May 1921 when the massacre happened. So this is not a kind of, nearly 200 of Ama-Israeli were killed.
Where was this massacre again?
It was in Bulhoek. It's called the Bulhoek Massacre. And this is just outside Queenstown. not far from
I remember
Queenstown.
you bringing it up
Yes.
last time.
But this is, and we have to explain this. This is a theme that is not dealt with in South African historiography. I'm not only talking about history taught in high schools, I'm also talking about histories that were taught in universities. This was only mentioned in a footnote, as if, it is just another event. And once again here, let's remind the viewers, anything that smacks of a black radical tradition is actually being minimized. And we always say that may make for good propaganda, but it makes for bad record keeping. It is bad record keeping, for South African historians, that such a volatile theme as the Bulhoek Massacre, is actually hidden from historical accounts. And we had to wait for for American historians. One of them is Robert Edgar, and the other is Robert Vincent, we have just talked about. And these are the historians who came and excavated the rich history, of the Bulhoek Massacre. And the only reason why it has been, relegated to a footnote is precisely because of the black radical, character that it gives forth. We did explain that even after the massacre, there were several other movements that emerged in the same area across the Transkei. We talked about, Prophetess Nontetha and her movement, and the fact that she ended up being confined, to a mental, hospital in Pretoria called Venskopis, that she died there in 1935. Just maybe to take the story a little further of Prophetess Nontetha, again because of the character of the movement that she led. She too was supposed to be disposed of completely from historical accounts. Again, it was not until 1974 when Robert Edgar came into the country. In fact, they were actually researching Marcus Garvey in the US, wanting to compile a full history of Marcus Garvey. And they realized that, you don't tell the Marcus Garvey story fully unless you go to Africa as well, and to South Africa too, which is, what led Robert Edgar to...
Rather South Africa in particular, because nobody
Africa
really followed Marcus Garvey like us.
Yes, but then you have the Shelembe movement, which may not have followed Marcus Garvey formally, but was actually along the same lines, the Chilembe movement in Malawi.
Well, the Chilembe movement, the point that Lebelo makes, and I think is that Marcus Garvey had a very, very strong impact in Malawi as well.
Yes, yeah.
You notice that their flag is red, black, and green.
Yes, yeah. Yeah.
And
also Clemens Kadali too. Although
Clemens Kadali came, he was a Malawian, and
he also a kind of a Garveyite.
You need to tell us all these. We don't know these people.
Well,
That's why we asked you to
but in particular, Prophetess Nontetha.
Yes.
This is the woman we want to be upholding.
Yeah.
You remember?
Let me just finish that. That thing.
Sorry.
Robert Edgar comes back into the country in '74, and by then, you have Ciskei being, kind of a self-governing territory, and the Transkei. But, he's able to navigate his way around what is South Africa and what are those, those homelands are. And he gathers all of this information, from people in the Ciskei, especially around, the Queenstown area, not far from where Prophetess Nontetha would have been. And some of the people in '74, they would have been in their 80s, probably a few in their 90s, would have lived through that experience. And so this was a very rich oral history that Robert Edgar was actually gathering. And I've always said to, Bomlora, that it is unfortunate because if one follows, the history of the region up until, the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, you will see family migrations coming out of the same region, coming into Johannesburg, into Springs, into Benoni, and into Germiston. And ultimately, those that come to Johannesburg actually end up in Orlando. And I was saying, if Robert Edgar had this historical imagination, he could have gone to Orlando, actually, and spoke to people there who would have been part of that experience as well. But, you know, it's a historical imagination he cannot be expected to have had, precisely because the reconstitution, you know, of those communities in the urban areas is a blank slate, you know, in South African history. But it is something that, you know, needs to be worked on. So ultimately, you know, Robert Edgar was able to, you know, piece together that history. And then after 1994, Robert Edgar realized that in actual fact, Prophetess Nontetha was buried in Vance Koppies in Pretoria, and that her family, you know, had never seen her grave. So he went back to searching for her grave, and he found it. And he found that because her identity had to be hidden, you know, someone was buried on top of her as well. I mean, you know, that's an attempt to completely obliterate all traces of Prophetess Nontetha. But he was able to...
May I just interject?
Yeah.
It bears noting that, you know, when she was imprisoned in Pretoria, the remnant of the Wellingtonian movement felt it important, felt her importance enough that they organized an entire pilgrimage. They walked from the Transkei to Pretoria on foot to go and visit Prophetess Nontetha. And this woman is an unknown. Do you see what I'm saying? So, Nazoge. So, you know, let us research and find out her doctrine and precisely why she held black people in thrall like that and inspired them to revolt against the authorities.
Maybe Pastor, if you can unpack her some more for us.
Yes, in fact, it gets even a little interesting. After 1994, Robert Edgar comes back, and you know he does all this work to get Prophetess Nontetha, and indeed, I mean, she gets reburied, you know, in her place outside Queenstown.
Really?
Yes, Robert Edgar actually facilitated the whole process, and this is where it gets interesting.
Kanjo, we take Robert Edgar.
Robert Edgar is a historian, an American historian. You know,
White
who was
American
actually
historian.
white for that
then he
matter,
came this side.
because he was studying Garvey, and he realized that Marcus Garvey had an impact, you know, in the history of the South African liberation struggle in the 1920s. So he was pursuing the story, coming to South Africa, and he did that around 1974-75. Then this was actually his PhD thesis. You know, he worked on that. So in 1994 he returned, knowing that Prophetess Nontetha's remains are still at Vance Koppies, and he worked on that to have that repatriated back to Queenstown, and he achieved that. Now, the interesting thing is that the whole ceremony was held at a place in Port Elizabeth, I think. And whose place was this? Vuyani Bungu, because Vuyani Bungu is a descendant of Prophetess Nontetha.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that's when they moved her remains in the 70s?
No, in the 90s.
In the 90s?
After 1994.
What?
Yes. 74 is when Robert Edgar was working on the work, on the dissertation. 20 years later, it is 1994, 1995. Robert Edgar comes back, and one of the things that he does is actually to get Prophetess Nontetha's remains repatriated. What about Ama Israeli? Robert Edgar again, you know, knowing that when the massacre happened, in actual fact, Ama Israeli had a tabernacle, you know, a kind of a tabernacle, a kind of a symbol that, you know, they worshipped at. And that symbol was actually taken. It was captured and taken to Kimberley to a museum. So when Robert Edgar came back in 1994, he made that his project as well. He went to Kimberley and found the tabernacle, and he returned it to to Ama Israeli. And Ama Israeli are still there today, you know, in and around, you know, the Queenstown area. And they do talk about this. They do actually recognize the 21st of May, you know, as the day of the massacre. Now, those are the two. But then the third that we spoke about were Amafela Ndawonye. And this was an organization of women, mainly, but there were men who actually participated in it as well. Remember, women were growing crops and having to sell them to Indian shop owners and Jewish shop owners in the countryside. And, there would be, from time to time, frequent contestations over prices, and over, quite a number of things. But it is the women who were in the forefront of that kind of struggle as well. And because they were actually responsible for growing crops, naturally, grabbing the land that they considered was their land and not vacant crown land became an issue of contestation. By 1927, the government had actually cracked down on Ama-Israel, on the Amafela Ndawonye. And 27 of them were put through a court process. 24 of them, of those convicted, were actually women, and 3 of them were men, and they were convicted to about between 2 and 4 years and sent to jail.
Since it's women's, are there any prominent females from Amafela Ndawonye that you can tell us about?
I would have to go and look it up. They would have had a couple of leaders who would have been in the forefront, and come to think of it, it being Women's Month. Yes, and but this was around 1927. But the biggest movement of this period, and the period we are talking about here is 1919 to 1939, that 20-year period. The biggest movement here was the Wellingtonian movement. And this also was, in actual fact, the leader of the Wellingtonian movement was Wellington Buthelezi. But, he went out around with the name Wellington Howard. And he claimed to have been an African-American who was a medical doctor in Chicago. But that is irrelevant for what, Wellington was able to achieve. Wellington actually mobilized masses of people across the Transkei, and he was picking up very relevant, kinds of issues. In 1927 and 1928, he organized a tax boycott, which meant that this would cripple, the administrative performance, at local government level, especially at, the magistrate and, just in terms of them being able to do the things that they do. And that was quite problematic. And, so, some historians would argue that when Herzog forced through the Native Administration Act of 1927, which bestowed upon the Governor General, unrestricted powers, particularly over what would have been native territories at the time, with a view to attacking, the Transkei, the Governor General decided to ban and to bar Wellington Buthelezi from entering the Transkei. In that case, he could not go to the courts because this was a proclamation by the Governor General, and it restricted, Wellington's movement. But he continued to, become a problem, for the colonial administration, because from time to time he would call mass meetings, and these would be held just across the border in Graaf-Reinet, and, people would continue to resist, whatever that they wanted to resist. But another thing about the Wellingtonian movement is that some of the chiefs at the time found it more sensible to join the Wellingtonian movement rather than to work for the colonial state. Loyalty to the Wellingtonian movement assured them, that's where they drew their legitimacy from. They could only draw their legitimacy from the masses, rather than from the colonial state. And one such example was Zibi, Chief Zibi and his mother, and Zibi, they were the kind of, chiefs in that particular area. But Zibi's brother, Charles, was also a chief, but very loyal to the colonial government. Zibi himself led, part of the Wellingtonian movement right down to 1939. And in 1939...
But how can he be loyal to the government the colonial government and be in the Wellington movement?
It is not. It is not. Yeah, Robert Zibi was a Wellingtonian, but his brother Charles was loyal to
Okay.
the colonial state. Yeah, in 1939, Zibi was actually captured, taken through the courts, and he was given a 4-year jail sentence. Him and 4 other leaders of the Wellingtonian movement, and that would have brought the Wellingtonian movement to its knees. But remember, the struggles of these people were struggles over land. And one of the things that they did to demonstrate their rejection of colonial hegemony or colonial imposition was to establish their own schools, build their own schools, build their own churches, and insist on actually being that independent. So NZB was actually running a number of schools, and her schools, the last of her schools, was closed in 1941. So she was able to resist up until 1941. But historically, we know that the Wellingtonian movement went up until 1939. Then the war broke out. Now, all of that, is part of the black radical tradition of the 20th century. But I've explained, that by its very nature, by its very emergence, the black radical tradition in South African history required or even demanded that it be minimized. And, throughout that period, that 20-year period has been played down so much in South African history. But then the question arises, if there was a mass movement of that character, taking place in South Africa, how did the ANC fit into it during that period? The last time we saw the ANC making any political statement was in 1921, when they actually sent a letter to Enoch Mgijima to please comply with the colonial order to move away from Crown land. And Mgijima did not even dignify that letter with a response. So the ANC at that point is beginning to show signs of going into paralysis. In 1922, you have the Rand strikes of 1922. This was a white miners' strike. It was white miners in around Johannesburg, around the mining towns, in Carltonville, in Benoni. But, the epicenter was actually in Fortsburg in Johannesburg. And that's where the miners had what looked like their headquarters. And that also led, was actually put down by Jan Smuts very brutally. Quite a good number of white miners were killed, and some were captured, taken through the courts, and were sentenced to very long sentences. One of them was Johnny Long, I think, who was particularly prominent in that strike. But at the same time, you have the emergence of the South African Communist Party in 1921. And by 1929, the South African Communist Party finds itself having to, get black members. Now, that becomes quite problematic because at the beginning it was a white party. But, when they get into international, kinds of gatherings, such as in the Comintern, in the International Socialist League, this is where the question of whiteness is actually being raised by other delegates. This actually happened in 1928, when Sidney Bunting and his wife, Rebecca Bunting, accompanied by a friend, a white friend of theirs, and he's the author of a very prominent book, Time Longer Than Rope is the title of the book. And the man is Eddie Roo. 3 of them went and represented, South Africa at the Comintern. And, black delegates from the US and some from the UK were particularly concerned about that kind of representation. It is at this stage, that the SACP begins to have a discussion about the Black Republic, the Black Republic thesis, because it is actually being forced upon the SACP by other delegates, who are part of the International Socialist League, and part of the Comintern. And the Kremlin would also insist on that kind of thing. At this stage, there are 3 prominent members, black members of the SACP, and they are going to be very prominent, into the 1930s, right down to the 1950s. The first was Albert Nzula, the second was Moses Kotane, and the third was, J.B. Marx. And they were the 3 prominent black leaders, who were inside the SACP.
Maybe Marx is a colored man.
No, he Xhosa actually.
Aibo.
Yeah, but Marx.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Well, it's only a surname, but yeah, no, he wasn't
Gosh.
colored. No, he actually lived in Nuclear in the western areas.
Yes.
No, he wasn't colored.
Nyama.
So these were the 3, very prominent black members inside the SACP, and they would become, the mouth of the SACP in, particularly in black political formations. But also they did bring some kind of membership, black membership to the SACP. And it also gets interesting because, in 1923, Makgatho steps down as president, and he is succeeded by Reverend Mahabane. And Reverend Mahabane has an uneventful term, from 24 to 27, and then he steps down. And this is important because the successor to Mahabane is actually Gumede, Josias Gumede. Gumede is actually Gumede's father, who became president of the UDF in the 1980s. Josias Gumede actually becomes the president. And Gumede is also a member of the SACP. And this gets to be particularly concerning, to the chiefs who are, in fact, at the time, very, very influential people inside the ANC. And yet, the language that Gumede uses is the language of working class hegemony, the kind of dictatorship of the proletariat. What that translates into in African society is that, just in terms of the language, Bafo is the lower class in, and the chiefs are saying Bafo cannot start dictating terms to us. They translate what Gumede is saying into that kind of a statement, that suggests that, lower class people are going to be, dictating terms to them as chiefs. And this is particularly true for the Khatla chiefs, the Tswana chiefs of the Khatla, who are at this time, the main benefactors of the ANC. And when their words, their word is actually respected. So Gumede was made to feel terribly uncomfortable as president. And in 1930, he is unseated, and Pixley Gaseme becomes the president. Pixley, it actually, it bode well for him because Pixley was actually married to, his wife was a royal, from the Zulu royal family. So in that sense, he was seen as, a kind of an ideal candidate. But that is what is happening in the ANC. And from the 1930s, throughout the 1930s, in the urban areas, it is not the ANC that is, a political party that is recognized. It is actually the SACP. In the 1930s in Orlando, when Sopasonke Mpanza establishes the Sopasonke Party, the political party is contesting political power with is actually the SACP and not the ANC. At any time between 1935, in that 10-year period, 35 to 1944, Mpanza is contesting for political power, not with the ANC, but with the SACP in Orlando. And this is actually happening in what was called the advisory boards. Now, the advisory boards were local government structures created by the colonial state to effect a kind of local government at local level. So in Orlando, you had the advisory board and political parties participating in these boards. And so for Sonke Party, the main opposition there, it would have been the main opposition to the SACP. Both of them were contesting for political space.
You speak of Umbanza. He is credited with building Soweto, am I right?
Yes, in fact, it's something that I'm going to explain. I know last week I rushed through it.
Yes.
But there's a time because it is important. It is going to be important to explain where he fits in. But at this stage, this period we have covered as when we looked at the black radical tradition. Now we are saying, where was the ANC at this time? So I'm looking at from 1921, say, up to 1932, or probably up to 1942. It's a 20-year period. Where was the ANC in that period? When the mass movement, was actually being steered by the Wellingtonian movement, by Prophetess Nontetha, by Ama by Ama Israel. We've talked about that 20-year period. And this is where the ANC was, led by Josias Gumede in 1927, but at the same time, being mired in SACP politics, because it is the SACP that seems to be at the forefront, which explains why. It is the SACP in the 1930s, that is participating in local government structures in the urban areas. In Brakpan, in Springs, it is the SACP and not the ANC. In historical terms, historians have actually come to terms with it, that in the period 1921 up to 1942, the ANC was actually moribund, and that is actually acceptable. It actually gets revived by A.B. Kuma. So Pixley Gaseme gets to be president in 1930 to 1934, and he steps down in 1934. Reverend Mahabane comes back for the second term, but he was ineffective in the first term, and he is just as ineffective in the second term. So that by 1937, even though he's still the president of the ANC, A.B. Kuma is beginning to actually, come to the fore, as a kind of go-to person, in terms of what the ANC is. But formally, A.B. Kuma becomes president in 1940. But from 1937, he starts reorganizing, the ANC. Now, this is important. Kuma's mentor, the person who, made quite an impression on Kuma, was not Marcus Garvey. He also went to the US. But the person who became Kuma's mentor was Booker T. Washington, not Marcus Garvey. And this is interesting. There is a paradigmatic difference between Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington. Marcus Garvey is the radical type. He was the radical. He led a black radical mass movement. Booker T. Washington, on the other, was pursuing the same kind of thing that the ANC associates with. You are fighting within the system. You are empowering yourself within the system and try and beat the system at its own game. It is that sort of thing. But if you think about Marcus Garvey, it is to disrupt the system. The idea here is to penetrate the system, disrupt it, and exist outside of it, while at the same time, interacting with it on your terms. And that's the difference. But Kuma then reorganizes the ANC when he takes over, in 1940. And in 1943, he begins to do things that will, open the ANC organizationally to different sections of the black masses. So it is the youth and it is the women. So in 1943, you have the Women's League. In 1944, you have the Youth League. That way you are opening up the movement, to the masses. But let it be understood, until then, it is quite clear we have actually gathered the evidence, and this is not being unfair to the ANC. We have actually put the evidence out there, and we have tested, their responsiveness to issues that were issues affecting the masses. And quite clearly, evidence does point to the fact that either the ANC was impermeable, to the kinds of concerns that the masses would have had, or it was simply indifferent. But I think it was simply indifferent, to the masses. And it is only in the 1940s that this effort is being made, to... So, in actual fact, what are we doing here? I think we need to give the viewers a sense of, a whole spectrum of what the black radical tradition was. I often say to, Abomlara, that one can have a sense of an unbreakable thread of the black radical tradition stretching from 1918 to 1977. It's a 60-year period, during the 20th century. Just to repeat it again, it is possible to discern in the history of the liberation struggle, the unbreakable thread of a black radical tradition from 1918 to 1977. It's a 60-year period. In other words, you do have evidence, historical evidence of a black radical tradition from Marcus Garvey to Steve Biko, from 1918 to 1977. This could be a very, interesting, study that a student can undertake at postgraduate level, preferably at PhD level, tracing that unbreakable thread, starting with the Amma Israeli, and ending with the Black Consciousness movement. Which brings me to your discussion, with Bramandla. If we can take just a few minutes to gather my thoughts, if you don't mind, can we?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
But before we do that,
yeah.
I wanted, Gosiam. Okay, no, it's fine.
But if you remember, we can still,
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
because I see that we're just rehashing.
what we did.
Yeah.
The idea here, and in fact, I need to explain this. The idea here is that we went back there because we wanted to see the origins of the black radical tradition. And in actual fact, what are we doing? We are talking about the making of the black radical tradition in 20th century, liberation struggles. That's what we are doing. So this is why we had to go back and,
I found the question.
yeah,
So you say that before Epikuma,
yeah,
ANC was quite elitist and
exactly.
removed from the masses.
Yes.
And it's funny because that's where they are now.
Yes, yeah.
So is there possibly some cycle happening inside the ANC where it's Africanist, then it goes back to being a white tool, then there's a back and forth tussle, it seems
I'm
like.
going to answer that question. And the way I'm going to answer that question also relates to the question that you put to Ramandla. When you said, were they doing it for the buzz? Now you're saying, is there a moment when they become Africanist? And this is where we talk about the character of the mass mobilization of the 50s. There is an impression that it does become, because when you say it is Africanist, and this is the strange thing about South African politics, particularly in the 1940s, 1950s and 1960s. When you say this particular person is Africanist or this particular organization is Africanist, that is inseparable from saying it is radical, and also that it is mass-based. And it is mass-based, it is radical, it is Africanist. And that's the character of South African politics in the 1950s. Now, I have to explain at what point the idea that the ANC was a mass movement, at what point was that constructed? It's a narrative, it's a historical narrative that was constructed at a particular point in time. And if we understand, the political context in which that characterization of the ANC was constructed, if we understand the period in which it was constructed, then we can understand, the mischief, because it is a mischief. We can understand the mischief that goes into characterizing the ANC as a mass movement in the 1950s. But do you mind, we shall come back to that when, yeah.